Hi, in this second video, I'm just going to explain a bit more about what it means to do critical media research and show you how critical media research, the concept of critical media research, is connected to the idea that media make social reality. So, the issue of what critical media research is very important because it really helps us identify the kinds of research questions that we need to ask in this class. And the idea is that critical media research, I've got a couple of quotes here, one by Paul Lazarsfeld and the other by James Carey. And without going into the long history, both were very important figures in exploring and developing media research in the way that we understand it today. And what both people were keen to do was to make a distinction between different sorts of questions. And when Paul Lazarsfeld talked about administrative research questions, he was really talking about, I suppose, problem-based media research that set out to examine how, for example, media could be used to create a particular kind of effect, particularly in the areas of consumer behavior and voting. So very often he said, well, one of the things with media researchers is they'll quite often start by asking, how can I use media to get consumers to buy my product, or use media to get voters to vote for me? And Lazarsfeld said that's not really the sort of most important question that we can ask about how media influence society. And in that, he was gesturing to the point that Carey makes in the second point, that really good media research begins from the question of how media technologies and content relate to the society in which they are situated. And what Carey is really beginning to state here is that critical media research begins from the assumption that our task is to understand how we can relate media industries, media content, and media technologies to social reality in its entirety. So, media research, media content, and media technologies, according to James Carey, are never simply either devices that allow us to achieve a particular communications task, nor is media content simply information or simply entertainment, content that's there to make us happy or simply tell us what we need to know in a given situation. It's much more important than that. Carey set about arguing that media content is actually something that tells us something about the values that structure our society, and in that sense is something that acts on the values that we use in everyday life. And this takes us to the next question, which is, why am I reading about prisons? You will have seen in the reading for this week, the reading is a piece of research from Belgium, where a couple of Belgian researchers interviewed people who were in prison for the first time. And what they wanted to know was how their expectations about what it was going to be like going into prison may have been shaped by media dramas about prisons. So I wanted to use this as an introduction to the idea that media creates social reality. And what I'm going to do now is explain why. What's the connection? Why am I reading, of all things that I've asked you to read, why have I asked you to read something about prisons? Well, the first thing is that although we might not think about it, prisons are something that we frequently meet on screens. There are a lot of prison shows on TV. I've just got a selection of some of the most popular ones. Orange is the New Black, Wentworth, Prison Break was enormously popular. Um, and and I suppose the point is that if you think about it, there are a lot of prisons are places that we see quite often in the media. And that kind of raises a question about why. Why is it that when people are sitting down to think about making an entertaining drama for TV audiences, quite often they say, I know, let's have it in a prison. And to explore why that might happen and what it might do, how it might influence audiences, this is a useful way of reflecting on one of the most interesting research findings about media and social reality. And this is that many people think that media entertainment, fictional drama, contains messages about how reality works that people use in real situations. So the idea is that fictional dramas about places like prisons contain messages about social reality, messages about social values that people actually deploy in everyday life, even though they know that what they're watching is a fiction. So let's go through how this particular reality effect might work. So the first question is one of the things we notice here is that there's a structure here, that prisons are something that crop up a lot on our screens, even though hopefully most of us will never actually go to a prison. So that's kind of an interesting paradox, isn't it? Prisons are a large and significant part of screen reality, even though they're not actually a part of our direct social experience, but they are a part of our society that we quite often think about. So this gives us an indication as to why prisons crop up on the screen a lot, because they make good dramas. Well, why is that? Well, I suppose prisons are one of the places that we know exist in society. They are one of the places that's important to society that we never actually encounter. And we also know that prisons embody social values. Why do we say that? Well, quite often, what we do is when we're talking about prisons, we're thinking about some really deep issues. We're thinking about truth, justice. Recently there's been a lot of debates about the overrepresentation of certain groups of people in prison populations. So prisons are important mediums of social thought. We think about prisons quite often reflect concepts of justice in our society. So prisons, we can say, are good places for drama because they embody social values. They are places where we can tell stories that get audiences to think about important issues. And this was particularly the goal I've got a still here from a very well regarded HBO drama called Oz, which in many ways was one of the founding TV shows that led to the development of the so-called second age of quality television. And Oz is a notable show because it was a fictional drama set in a hyper-violent, maximum security prison. And it was an incredibly violent show. But the producers of the show said that they'd made that decision quite deliberately. Violence was never in the show for the sake of violence. But the interesting thing about the use of violence in Oz was that you always saw the consequences of violence. Violence was shown as something which was in many respects a human tragedy. So the sort of violence a human tragedy that had a disastrous impact on both the victim, but also the aggressor. And the producers of Oz were talking about the fact that even though their show was fictional, they really wanted people to, when they were watching this show, to think very deeply about what it meant to incarcerate people. So even though this was a fictional show, it was a show that was developed in order to get people to think about very real issues about justice and equity in society. Now, the interesting thing about how that relates to the Belgian case study is that prisons in Belgium are really quite different. So this is a picture from a real Belgian prison, and it shows quite a nice setup. You've got a nice meal, you've got a home computer, all of these sorts of things. And what it reflects is the fact that some prisons have a very different philosophy from the sort of philosophy from the sorts of places that we normally see on screens. Now, of course, most of the prisons that we see on screens are American screens, so they represent a justice system that's very different from other parts of the world. But the interesting thing that the researchers found, that Van den Bulk and Van den Bosch found in the research on Belgian prisoners, is that it's quite rational for Belgian prisoners who are going to prison for the first time to wonder about what's going to happen to them. And they found that those expectations were based more or less on TV shows that came from America, because that was the only kind of direct, symbolic, or in fact, any type of encounter that people had ever had with prisons. So you had this really complex situation whereby you've got young Belgian people going to prison for the first time, wondering what's going to happen to them, understandably being very frightened, and basing their expectations on things that they've seen from America, even though they know that that is fiction. So, again, what we have here is the idea that even though people knew that American shows about prison dramas were fictional, they nevertheless became a thinking resource as people set about establishing their expectations concerning what was about to happen to them. And of course, one of the things that we know is that there are a number of places like that. So most of us will spend either no or very little time in, well, I guess we all spend time in hospitals, but not a lot of time in hospitals. Hopefully, most of us don't have much connection with the police. We don't have much connections with courtrooms. But all of these places are places which crop up very frequently on our screens. So we think about these places not as real social places that we occupy, but as symbolic places that we encounter quite often on our screens. And this is true the world around. I've got cop shows from America, cop shows from India, a courtroom drama from Korea, and a hospital drama from China. So this is a kind of a recurrent pattern across cultures where we are constantly being shown real places that are important, that are the foundations of our society in many respects, but we only ever encounter them in a dramatized form. And what global culture has evident research has indicated is that these things actually shape our expectations about how the world works. So, for example, we might expect police work to be far more forensic, far more exciting, and far more detailed than it actually is. And that shapes our expectations if we ever encounter any of these places. So, what's the point? Well, the point is to say that media play a role in creating reality because there's significant evidence to suggest that even media fiction plays what I would call an important aligning role in reality. Even though when we know we're watching fiction, quite often we use that fiction to develop sets of expectations about what those places operate like in the real world. And quite often we use those fictions as a point of comparison between things that happen in our real social world. And the evidence is quite clear that people will use ideas from fictional media to think about the world that they live in. And moreover, the people who make media fiction kind of expect us and want us to do that. So the relationship between media reality and social reality is that it's a relationship, and it's one that can have some pretty profound effects.